So first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this oral narratives of Latinos in Ohio. Today is Monday, October 5th, 2020. Can you please tell us your full name?
Oscar Fernandez.
Okay. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, but I always like to add that I was made in Cuba.
Okay.
Yeah, and I grew up in my early life in Cuba, and then when we returned my family to the States, I lived in New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father finally had it with snow, and we moved to Texas, and we stayed there many years of my life, my high school years. Went to a commuter college there, Lamar University in Beaumont. And then, out of a whim, I applied to go to graduate school at Yale. And lo and behold, I got accepted. And so I lived in New Haven, Connecticut for a good while. Returned to Texas, and then desires to teach and practice, moved to Montana to teach at Montana State University. And it was there that I met a good friend of mine and coaxed me to apply at Ohio State. And that's what brought me to Columbus. And I've lived most of my life now in Ohio.
Right.
That's my adopted home.
Right. What year did you move to Ohio?
This would have been in 1981.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I've been here ever since.
Ever since. Tell me about your childhood. You seem like you lived in different places. What was your life like as a young boy?
Well, I still have obviously memories in Cuba, living there. I remember there was an interesting little farm that next to a little apartment-like complex, because there were all these animals, goats and chickens, and I talked to the boy of the farmer's son. But then I remember a very, for a kid that age, traumatic experience. My father was in the military. He was an officer. And he was involved in a military conspiracy, a group that historians call Los Puros, young middle-class officers. And the conspiracy never took place. Someone squealed 3 days before. But I remember as a little boy playing in the living room with little toy soldiers, coincidentally. And I remember my father running into the kitchen, these Jeeps screeching to halt outside, military men breaking down the door, going after Dad, arrest. Anyway, but I remember that. And I remember my father was in prison for about 3 months, as I learned. He was court-martialed, blacklisted. He couldn't get any work in Cuba. And so he wrote to his dean back in the States, and the dean said, well, come start your master's degree. And that's when we left Cuba. This is about 1957. And America was a big shocker for me culturally, and I tell my students now it's hard to believe I didn't speak a word of English at one time. And I remember my mother dressing me for my first day of school. She didn't realize in America everything's a little less formal, but she put a whole suit on me, a tie, even a little handkerchief, and even a little attaché case to take with me. So that was my first day of school, and as you can imagine, and it was a very rough part of town. I had to learn how to protect myself quickly. But ever since, I always felt, always looking in from the outside. I always felt as a foreigner. And we came at a time when there were, at least for my mom and dad, there weren't any large Latino communities in America, especially up where we were living in New Jersey. So I was never around other children, Latino families. And something that became over time, a little bit of embarrassment. My Spanish was never as proficient, although my ear's very good. I can read it very well, but it's part of me, Elena. I'm such a perfectionist. If I can't speak correctly in Spanish, so. But I always.
Were you? I'm sorry. How old were you when you moved with your family?
I was about 5 years old because I remember starting the first grade in school. Immediately, it was very. I felt very inept. People couldn't understand me. I couldn't understand them. This was before any pride in ethnicity and all that. The nuns, God bless them. You not only had to learn English, I had to get rid of my accent. And my dad was typical of, a Latino father. You come to a new country, well, you got to get acclimated right away. And so he refused that we speak Spanish at home. But my mother put her foot down. So she spoke Spanish to us and we English. So years later, friends of ours would come over and they'd hear this halfway conversation. Mother talked to us in Spanish and we'd respond in English. And they'd be like, what? But little did I realize that those experiences, very negative at the time, would really shape me to the kind of designer that I wanted to be. And I have been for the last 40 years. Because I never have forgotten what it's like not to understand, not to be accepted, how to create access to information. That's something that would live on for a long time. But we would move, again to parts of the country where there wasn't large Latino communities, except in Texas. And that was some very interesting experiences there. But no, I still remember, in fact, I have so many photos. There's one of me freaking out at Macy's on Santa Claus's lap because I just couldn't believe what this guy was. Because, in Latin America, it's the three kings that come. It's not Santa Claus. And I always use that as an opening title slide of the culture shock for me coming to America. But yeah, I always felt that. Even now, I'm probably some people's American as apple pie, but I still feel connections to my roots. I think in the last 10 years, I've just been more aggressive and learning more. Many regrets of not having asked my grandparents while they were alive, tell me about your father. What was he like? So I've had to do a lot of becoming an amateur or a genealogist, being a detective. But I'm honoring all of them, I feel.
Right. Yeah. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one brother. He lives in Houston, Texas.
So you're the oldest?
I'm the oldest, yeah.
So tell me about just growing up, the two of you as brothers. What's the difference in age? 4 years. He's 4 years younger. Okay. We're very different personality-wise. He's been in sales for a long time. He's very outgoing, can turn on the personality, the drop of a hat. I've always been more, a little introverted, more quiet, more of a deep thinker. I always am more the observer of details. And like to this day, politically, we're polar opposites. And like one good example, since high school, Elena, I've always put an accent over my A in Fernandez. And I did it back then because it was unique and also because I had pride, Wow, we have an accent, Dad. That's great. Where he refuses to use his. He thinks that's silly. And we've gone back. I've shown him like Time magazine cover of the woman who was president of Argentina at one time, and she Fernandez. And I said, look, there's an accent. And so we've been a little bit of tension over the years. What did your parents do professionally?
My father was a mechanical engineer. His specialty was metallurgy. And he worked for many years for Texaco Research. That's what brought us down to Texas when he had it with snow, Elena. I remember he arrived one day in a snow blizzard. He had to leave the car, hike 2 miles in the snow. And when he arrived, he looked like Omar Sharif and Dr. Zhivago, you know, when he had the icicles on his eyes and all that. And all he kept saying, we're moving, I can't stand it. So my mother was a school teacher. And it's her side of the family that I get drawing ability, the more visual oriented. She is an incredible lady, but yeah, she taught school. She had a certificate to teach kindergarten in Cuba. And I still have all her certificates and all her projects she worked on, watercolors. And then in Pittsburgh for a time, she thought, I'm going to teach Spanish. And so she went to, taught in a high school. And I remember one evening, it was towards Christmas, a number of her students and a teacher there were invited. And to give you the time frame, I remember, I was so embarrassed, but Mom coaxed me to do the twist in front of her high school students there. This was about 1963, 62. But she loved it. I can imagine what her classes was like. I mean, she was a very jovial, outgoing lady, great personality. But she didn't work after those years. But Dad, he was a staunch engineer.
Right. So did you grow up with your grandparents? Were you able to see them?
On my father's side, the one that's in that photo that I'll share with you in a minute, he and my grandmother left Cuba about a year or two afterwards. They came to the States. They didn't want to be away from us. So my grandfather sold his side of the business, the hat factory. My mother's side, her parents, they stayed behind. But they would come to live with us in 1966. We were vacationing in Miami. We had family there. And just fate, one of the relief flights that Castro had allowed, they boarded the plane. Both they and my uncle, my mother's brother, his wife, and my cousin, Arturo, who lives in New Jersey now. And they arrived there the time we were in Miami. And I remember seeing the hurricane fence and all that, and they were going through the process lines. And so they came to live with us in Texas for a while. And I remember, the first couple of days when they were home with us at dinner, my mom my grandfather would be telling my dad the conditions in Cuba. And my grandmother goes, shh, quiet. Somebody might be out in the window listening. And boy, that just hit home what the conditions were like. But yeah, they lived with us for about 3-4 years. And then another pandemic during the Hong Kong flu, my grandfather, he passed away. He got too sick. So, but yeah, those were the times that, looking back, I regret so much. I couldn't have asked them. Now that I have this deep interest in our family roots and history, and I could have asked them so many questions. So
tell me about your dad's side of the family and the hat factory, if you want to.
Sure.
Pick up, the picture you have.
Well, this picture is, as I said, I'm the family archivist, and I'm a kind of an amateur restorer of photographs. This picture was if you would have seen the original, it was in such bad condition. Matilde, my dad's mother, had already put Scotch tape on it, which you don't do to me. But anyway, I'm pretty good with Photoshop. But I loved working on this picture, especially when it's very detailed in the repairs, because it really makes you look. And it can give you a lot about the narrative behind it. And even though he's not pictured, but one of the other brothers, these are my dad's first cousin. This is my father at 4 years old, wearing that little beanie cap, sitting on the table. This is my grandfather, Oscar. And this was his brother-in-law, who sometimes gets confusing. He's also named Fernandez. But anyway, but one that was missing, Alfonso Fernandez, who's still alive, amazingly, he filled in a lot of the answers of who was this, who was that person. Like this woman was my grandfather's sister. And this would be a niece. And then this guy, for some reason, was nicknamed the Cutter. He was very good at cutting the leather. But he filled in a lot for me. And the more I started putting this in perspective, Elena, I realized how important this factory was, the Casa Fernandez. Because of it, they had a very healthy contract with the military. Orders for hats for all the officers throughout Cuba, the Cuban military. And it's those business relationships that developed that would allow my father, when he came of age, to apply to the Cuban military school, their West Point. And so he would have known some general to write a recommendation letter for my father. So my father got into the military as an officer. And because he was an officer, he applied for this big offer of a scholarship to come study at an engineering school in America. And he was one of 3 selected out of the 300 applicants. And so there's another element that because of this factory, we came to America. And
how long had that factory been in the family? Like, who started it?
These two started together. My grandfather and the brother-in-law. They started it in 1928, and it was in business till about 1964 when everything was nationalized and they sold it all. But
and it was a family business that a lot of family members were.
It was a family business. And he came from a large family, Elena, Oscar. He came from a family about nine kids. But I never knew much about the descendants or other family till now. I'm learning it because, Latino temperament. He and his brother-in-law got in a big fight about the business, about investments and all that. My grandfather took it to the whole family, and he got so upset because his family sided with a brother-in-law. And that's when he said, well, I've had it. I'm going to start my own business and all that. So there was all these other kids I never knew of because I guess the tensions were pretty a wide gap because my dad would never talk about it. I'd even say, why do we have such a small family? But
like we just don't talk to the other side.
Oh, I know, for years. But I love this photograph, and I hope to go there someday. In fact, Alfonso told me in Miami that he went before the pandemic arrived, and he walked to the factory, and it's still there. It's a different business. But he said, if you go back, they call me Oscarito. Oscarito, if you go back in the back along the window frame, my father still, you can see his carving of his name and 1928. Wow. It's still there. So
I need to take a picture of that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure.
I'm curious, how many Oscars are there in your family?
Well, my father, the one with a little beanie hat, he was actually named Oscar. So I would have been Oscar the Third. But my grandfather, Oscar, he was a character. And so when my father learned that his first name really wasn't Oscar until he went to register to vote the first time. And it said, no, sir, your name is Santiago Oscar Fernandez. And he couldn't understand, so he checked it out. And yeah, the birth certificate was placed Santiago Oscar Fernandez. And Dad thought he was Oscar all this time. Right. So the theory goes that my grandfather, having a son born, probably got so excited and partied that he was a little tipsy when he was listing the names.
Filling out the paperwork.
Yeah. So my dad became Santiago, and American friends called him Santi. That became his nickname.
Wow. Yeah. There's 3 Oscars in
Yes,
mi familia.
technically there's 3
En mi
Oscar.
familia también.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, great. That's a great story. How do you mentioned earlier that your dad, sort of when you guys moved to the States, he was, very purposeful on you all adapting, right?
Yes.
And becoming, this is your new home, so learn the ways of
Yes.
the U.S. And I imagine maybe as young children, it might have been a little easier, although, you had to navigate some of those, a new geography, a new
Yes.
language, a new.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remember some of the things that maybe your parents went through as they were also, calling the U.S. their new home? I don't know if your mom had a different process than your dad, if you can remember that.
Oh, yes. Well, the first time they came to the States to study, I was born in his freshman year at Stevens Institute. Of course, these are things my mother would relate to me later over the years, but okay, she didn't know any English. My father had learned English in high school and in the military school. So he was, at least he could communicate. I remember Mom telling me going to the Italian bakery because at least she could get some communication with the Italian Americans, the Italian and Spanish a little bit. They could get the words in. Soap operas, she said, was the quickest way she learned how to speak English. And I remember she was an amazing lady. I remember her, since we're coming close to Halloween, she thought that was the greatest holiday, that you get free candy. Well, Elena, I remember that first Halloween, she dressed up like a man. She got all my dad's clothes, a tie, and she was going to go out with us because she couldn't believe people giving candy for free.
Right.
But she was always reminded us of the life back in Cuba. As I said, she refused that order, or Dad recommended, of speaking only English in the house. No, she was going to speak Spanish. And but I remember instances of people. My mom was accepted immediately. Her personality, they always loved to hear her mispronounce words like pajamas, pajamas, and they would pajamas, Mela. That was her nickname. Short for Amelia is her middle name. Everybody called her Mela, Melita. I think there were times where it was hard for her. My father was so loving, but I think it was hard for her to get acclimated to this new place. Not only new environment, but the seasons were much colder than she ever experienced. The first snowfall, of course, it's a wonderful novelty and experience, but then when it gets much colder, it's not liked very much. Some of the other things I remember. I remember them having parties. They always would invite American friends and introduce them to Cuban cuisine. I don't think my parents were, reclusive. I think they wanted, as much as they wanted to be accepted in the United States, they are going to accelerate. So they would have parties all the time, invite the neighbors over. I remember one particular family, their names were Hudson, and they became good friends of my parents the first time they came to the States. And then when we arrived, not of our choosing, but I remember they were there immediately and put us in this very cheap hotel just till we found accommodations on the university, a dormitory. But I know Mom must have went through a lot, that whole scenario when Dad was arrested. I remember us sleeping. In fact, I still remember us sleeping in the house one last time before we went to America. We didn't have any mattresses. They had to sell all the furniture they had. We were basically sleeping on the floor. And windows, you didn't have screens like you do there in
Right.
Cuba. Everything's open. I remember there was a cat that jumped into the house, and Dad was looking for it at night. I still remember this cat looking in the bedroom before he's being chased away from Dad. But I know it must have been, I don't know, just scary for my mother going through all that.
Were they, you mentioned earlier that he was basically blacklisted, right?
Yes, in the newspapers.
So did he feel safe living in Cuba or coming
No.
back to visit? No.
No, he didn't. I mean, it almost, it was very welcomed for him, I'm sure, because, Batista was a pretty bad regime. Mm-hmm. And the state police was pretty brutal. Mm-hmm. So it was a good thing that he left. I remember for us to get out, period, in the court martial, because there were members of the conspiracy that were executed. Mm-hmm. But my grandfather, he had to pay a ransom, a bribe to a general that he knew, again, with the hat factory connection. Mm-hmm. And the story my dad would say that he would not hand over the money till he had some proof of life. Mm-hmm. And so they went up above this hotel to look out in this courtyard where all the prisoners were, and the general handing my grandfather binoculars, he said, there's your son, look, he's walking around. Mm. And so I can't imagine what Mom went through, mm-hmm. and my parents, but I know there must have been, for my father, certain relief to get out. Right.
Did they ever go back?
We went back in whenever Castro finally was victorious and Batista had left. We went back a summer 1960, 61, I remember. Mm-hmm. And we spent a whole summer. I remember seeing everybody with beards and the green fatigues walking around. Everybody was delighted. I remember my grandmother Anita thinking, oh, Castro, he's Jesus Christ reborn, he's back. But it was a very celebratory time mm-hmm. in Havana. And my grandfather, my mom's dad, he worked for MGM. He was a film distributor where he would make sure certain films would go to this theater here in all of Latin America. And that's how Mom got free passes to go to the movies all the time. And that's where oh my God, talk about trivia facts loaded in her mind of all these American actors and Spanish films. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Elena, I'm sure it was very tough for them, especially my mom,
Tell me about some of the things that your father and mother did to maintain some of those traditions, or being Cuban, or remembering where you come from. It seems like food was one of the ways. Were there
food,
other
certainly.
ways? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the language. Mm-hmm.
And the language. And they were able to get out photo albums out. I know Mom always had a collection of postcards of around Cuba. Mm-hmm. She would always tell me stories about special national holidays, city holidays, how the farmers would come in and they would have their farmers markets and all that. What other things she would share or tell us about? Superstitions. I would learn later, she got it a lot from her mother, but spiritualismo, which is really big in Cuba. Yeah. Oh, my grandmother believed in that. Mm-hmm. I remember one instance, this is when she came to live with us, Elena, and I was on the floor about 12, and with my foot, I was rocking the rocking chair mm-hmm. by itself. Mm-hmm. She started screaming and ran out of the room, and she says, the devil was in there, don't do that. But Mom had her little superstitions as well. And then telling us stories about how she grew up, mm-hmm. what she did in school. She had all her artwork, and she would share them with me because she recognized right away, early age, that I could draw as well. Mm-hmm. And um, but yeah, she would tell a lot of good stories, some funny, some kind of sad. But I know she wanted us not to forget.
Right, right. What about music? Did you grab?
Oh, music. I mean, now that's another thing. I'm embarrassed. Even though I can feel the move, I can feel vibration, but my mom, oh, did she love to dance. Salsa, mambo, I mean, all of those. Song music. And I do, to this day, have an appreciation for it. And I have all these recordings and all that. But, oh, my mom, she'd just hear one note, boom, she's up on the floor. And, but that was another way, you know. And Mom was very knowledgeable about the music. You know, she would tell me how, like, song, which is a very popular music form out of Cuba, how it came about, how it came from the African populations, the culture mix, and the different singing styles, the kind of a cappella kind of Latin style of singing. And then she would tell me about different Spanish words, because as time went on, she would interact with other Latinos from other parts. The different words became fascinating. That's something that I'm always great interest in, of just the differences in cultures, from terminology to colors to all that. For instance, in Cuba, you know, they call the bus the guagua.
No, wow. Yeah.
And I'm like, and I would ask friends from Argentina, from Mexico, and said, we never had that word. But it's a very unique word for Cuba.
Right.
But no, she would never let us forget it. I think just her personality, her karma coming out, I'm not going to forget Cuba.
Right.
Dad was more, of course, accepting. I mean, he really wanted to adopt any customs or any kind of start recognizing certain holidays. But I know there were people in Cuba that were still interested in him and in the American government. I remember Elena in was it the 60, before the Bay of Pigs. My dad was recruited by CIA to be part of it. But my mom put her foot down. She says, you're not going to get involved in that. But no, Cuba was always on my mind, as that song says. And so after 1960, I would not return till 2007. And that was the greatest. I spent a week there in Havana, and that was one of the best experiences I ever had, both emotionally and intellectually.
What foods do you remember from your...
Oh, I remember a lot of them, and I still eat. My lovely wife of 38 years, she learned all the recipes from my mother. Black beans, frijoles negros, but the real syrupy frijoles negros. I don't like the watery. I like the real heavy syrup and pour it over white rice. The special roasted pork, plátanos fritos. But I always like the in-between. I don't like the ones that are real sweet and soft that's been ripened. I like the one where the outer shell has been still a little hard, but inside the meat is soft and sweet. And I remember the memories, my mom cooking, you know, in the grease and then putting them in. She'd cut them up, the plátanos, the plantains, and then pull them out, put them on a new grocery bag and smash them down. It was a cheap way, and then put them back in. Yuca, fried yuca. What's the one? Arroz. Ropa vieja.
The coffee, do you remember?
Oh, coffee. I am so addicted to coffee. I still make Cuban coffee in the little turn thing and steam it through. But other thing, flan and Cuban bread pudding. It's a very different style, but you can imagine Cuba with all the sugar, everything's going to be really sweet. Yeah, and just the smells, you know, the fragrance coming out of the kitchen. My mom didn't know how to cook one bit when she got married, but boy, she just became a master chef. Everybody came when Mela was cooking.
Probably a way for her to keep those roots, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Learning to go.
Well, because, even though she's been gone for some time now, she, will always find it. Where's the Cuban restaurant? You know where the best is? In Louisville, Kentucky.
Really?
Oh my God. I'm sorry, Mom, but one of their dishes is better than yours.
Cuidado.
Yeah.
Are are your parents are not alive anymore?
No,
Okay.
no. My mom passed away last March.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And they lived in Texas?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know you mentioned that there's a connection with Spain. So
Yes.
who was from Spain? Can you tell me that side of history?
I have found on the, let's say, the four branches, your father's parents and then your mother's parents. And then from there, all of them came from Spain. One line came from the Canary Islands, surprisingly.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's one that's been the mystery on my mother's father's side. I think a Danish connection.
Mm-hmm.
Because they had, sometimes I see the name Steele appear after Hernandez, because I know the last name is usually the mother's maiden name,
Right.
And it was spelled Steele. And he lived at a time on St. Thomas Island, many years ago. It used to be a Danish colony.
Mm-hmm.
So, and just the last things I remember my mom saying, yes, I remember my grandfather had blue eyes, he had blonde hair, but I'll never know that. But the others were from Spain, and I followed them pretty deeply. The one from Riaño, that's my grandfather Oscar, and they came from a region just north of Burgos. And then the name Riaño, that village, I found it in an old document that I had somehow gotten. And there was my great-grandfather Vicente's marriage certificate. And in there, he's telling whoever the recorder is, yes, my family's from Riaño. And I had never known that. And so with Google search, I could find, and then I find it on the map, and there it is. I could zoom in. And that's how I found those pictures of Riaño. It's a very small village, but it makes sense because one memory or story I learned from his son, Oscar, great-grandfather Vicente. I remember, what do you remember about Vicente? He says, oh, I remember he'd always tell me he had always a scar under his eye, and he said he got it from a snowball thrown at him. And I thought that was the weirdest thing. But now it all makes sense because in that region of Spain, that does snow. And wow. So I like making connections like that. I have on my mother's side, or his wife, Matilda, her surname was Prego, which is unusual. And they came from the region of Spain where Franco was from. Oh, what was the name of that village? I've had it all written down one time. But they came from that region. And I wondered, Prego, how's that get that name? Because, it's Italian.
Yeah.
And then I've done some research where 1400s, 1500s, there were a lot of Italians that migrated to that region of Spain. So maybe.
Right.
Another from, on my mother's side, from Cordoba, Spain, Poblete. And these cousins I've recently connected to on Ancestry were so appreciative. They knew that because one was heading to Spain and stopped in Cordoba. So now to know one of her ancestors was from there. And then the other one's from the Canary Islands. That was unusual. But I like those connections. I like making sense of it all and where we all came from. And in a way, I'm, putting all these documents together for our descendants, give it to them.
So who was the first generation that came to Cuba? Your great-grandfather or your...
I think in that time of the 1860s to 70s, Elena, from what I gathered, there was a lot of migration, almost similar to a lot of Irish who came during the famine in their region. But I guess in Spain, the conditions were pretty bad. The story goes my great-grandfather Vicente came with his brother. They were 12 years old. They hiked all the way to, I think it was Valencia, one of the ports, and came to Cuba. My mother, and I'm sorry if I get you confused, but my father's mother, her dad was from this region where Franco was from in that northern part of Spain. And I learned later he came because there was a promise that if you joined the military there, the Spanish military, you'd be given special bonuses and all that. And I still have pictures of his identity card and all that. He had to go to the Spanish consulate in Cuba periodically to get it renewed, because even after the Spanish-American War was over, he still wanted to be a Spaniard. And that's what my father told me. Yeah, he was proud. I forget the nickname they had for those Spaniards, but he always wanted to get renewed. He was a Spaniard. He was not a Cuban. He was a Spaniard.
Okay. That's interesting. You said that when you came to the States, you only spoke Spanish, and then had to learn English, and then now you feel like English became your first language, I guess.
Yes. Yes.
So tell me about your experiences with Spanish. At one point, you mentioned that, and you still understand, and you would converse with your mom in that way. So she would speak Spanish, and you would respond in English. So tell me about this experiences with language, with you and your family.
You mean the language?
Spanish.
Speaking Spanish? Well, it would continue on even till the latter part of her life. My mom would always speak to us in Spanish, unless there were other English-speaking people in the room. But it was always Spanish, and I would respond in English, and she just accepted it a long time ago.
Did that change at all when you moved to Texas, like having to maybe use language, or was that not? Like in your school, did you ever hear Spanish?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. Because there was, a large Mexican-American communities down there. I was kind of gratified that I could use my Spanish. I remember, I know it was an easy A, Elena, but I did take Spanish in high school. But it, over the years, it did bother me. I never overcame it. I think again, because of my being a perfectionist, but amazingly, I still understand it quite well. I can read it pretty well. In fact, when I did go to Cuba in 2007, just to show you an example, I met a lot of Cuban graphic designers, and we've gotten to be friends, and we still email each other. Well, early on when we started these dialogues, this is back in 2007, it became apparent it was taking a while to get responses and all that. Till finally, he's a good friend now, Pepe Menendez, very well-known graphic designer in Cuba. He said, Oscar, you know what we'll do? I'll write to you in Spanish and you write to me in English. Because I understand English, you understand the Spanish. So that's how we communicate. I think part of the culture can still come sometimes. Elena, I know when I've spoken, I try to start talking to an Argentinian or un Chileno. They start laughing right away. You're Cuban. Because I turn on the gestures, the hands, the way I say certain words. They say, Cubano.
Right.
And so anyway, at least that made me feel a little well. But I'm very sensitive to, everything, being a visual person, gestures, expressions, color and moods. when I went to 2007 to Cuba and spent a week, people always ask me my impression when I went there. I told them often, I saw my mom and dad often in the streets, because the way, the Cubans would be having a real heated conversation or making jokes, the way they would talk and the way they would, I'm going, oh my God, that's mom, or that's dad talking. So it was very, heartfelt experience. And so it's ingrained with me. It's deep down, but the language, I love hearing it. I'm very biased. People say French is very beautiful, but I said, I like Spanish. I always listen to a lot of the Cuban music. I know the words. I know there's some terms now that I pick up. I wish my mom was still around to explain to me what it meant. What's that particular word mean? But yeah, I don't know.
Tell me about your school years. So you're a graphic designer, and you actually ended up coming here to Ohio to study. And you say that there's a history, right, of sort of artists, creative people in your family, including your mom.
Yes.
So tell me about this, how you sort of became your own, right, artist and creative person. Were you always creative when you were younger?
I remember one of the first experiences in America going to kindergarten school. I remember teachers raving about some drawing or I had done. So right there, I must be pretty good at something drawing. Then mom would share a lot of her drawings that she kept and all that. And my father was never, he never pressured us to get into a career. He would have loved for me to have been an engineer. In fact, he advised me to take all these preparatory courses in high school. But finally, my senior year, I got up the courage to say, Dad, I don't think I want to be an engineer. But he was a beautiful guy. It bothered him a little, but he didn't hold any grudges. But what I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to get into visual arts. I knew I wanted to maybe be an illustrator. I could render pretty well, figure drawing, everything. I thought I was going to replace, there's a well-known illustrator, American illustrator named Norman Rockwell. If you're familiar with him, I thought I'd replace him when he died, but that didn't happen. And but it wasn't enough, Elena. I mean, I could draw pretty well, but I wanted more challenges. And then I was fortunate that in 1 year, this fellow came to guest teach for a year, and he had gone to design school. And design was so fascinating. The problems we had, sure, you involve your visual skills, but I love the aspect of design. It's like art and science coming together, where you had to rationalize, you had to think about the problem at hand, problem solving. And wow, I was just taken. In fact, I remember at a dinner, my father had just learned, oh, so you're going to be a graphic designer? Oh, okay. He's still apprehensive. And then I was talking to the person next to me, and I mentioned, oh, yeah, and we do problem solving. Elena, my dad got up. Problem solving? You do problem solving? I said, yeah, Dad. Oh, right. So it's not that bad. And, we have something in common because, engineers problem solving methodology. And so it's a wonderful skill, the ability to draw, to visualize, because I'm a very observant, very detail oriented. And that ability to draw, I kept wondering, okay, it's from my mom's side. I know her mom could draw, and she was a poblete. And then recently, her last remaining cousin, she lives in Missouri. I call her once a month and we chat. She filled me in that her great-grandfather, her grandfather would be my great-grandfather. His name was Juan Poblete, came from Cordoba, was an ironworks guy. He would do all those beautiful ironworks. That was his trade that he made. He's part silversmith, but he also had to draw these decorative patterns and do it for, wealthy families, for, the furniture. And I go, that's it. It's from the Poblete side, So,
I mean, some people say also making hats, right, is the art of hat making. So
that's right.
Also
yeah, you're
creative.
dealing with these forms, these shapes, and but it served me well. And I think the experiences I had, I don't know if you'll have a question like this, but everything just fell into place. Everything has kind of prepared me for my profession, my career. And as a designer, I haven't done, I've done commercial work, brands, identity, but I've preferred more the giving back, helping society. For instance, I've been working on a whole type font to help children who have challenges reading for the first time. Okay. And where if they roll over this letter, they can't pronounce the letter P. If they roll over it, then a penguin comes up or a peach, and they hear a sound, and it helps them prepare for that. Because it always goes back to Elena when I first came to this country, not being able to be understood, feeling inept, feeling unqualified, not skilled. And I always had a mentor who told me, you cannot design anything until you know what it feels like not to understand. And so that sense of empathy, which I've had partly as my personality, but it fit well as a designer, and that's the kind of thing. So I always want to know their pain. I want to know what their backgrounds are. I want to know how I can create a bridge to access information that they can't reach to. And I'm a very user-centric. I believe a lot in usability. And I believe very strongly that it was those experiences I had that makes me recognize what it's like for the end user. And I mean, that's what I tell my students. Sure, I know you can make it look so beautiful, but does it work? Does it work not for me and you, but for them you're intending to do it for? And I think it's because of the experiences I had.
Tell me about you as an artist. I mean, you've began, to tell me a little bit about sort of your interest and your passion and creating something that's going to mean something and maybe fix a problem if that's the case. But tell me a little bit more about that. And I also have a question regarding Cuba. Is there any Cuba in the work that you do? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there anything that speaks of you in it? It's
subtly. You could see it. Some of the, like even a typeface I might select. But yeah, I'm more Latin in my taste and design. I mean, I believe a lot in, problem solving. I like complex problems. I like modular things. I like things that are in systems. But where my background comes out is, as I said, maybe the typeface I select, the colors I pick. One of my favorite colors is warm yellow. I like picking yellow. It's the sun. It's life. Even though a lot of my teachers, Elena, were, Swiss and German and very dogmatic and everything sans serif and everything pristine, I'll tend to pick it's nice serif fonts, and I like things warmer a little bit in the design. My colors, my preference in colors was revealed when I visited Cuba in 2007. All the color all over the place. These unheard of color combinations. I couldn't believe it. But, I've made some weird decisions on color combinations, color palettes for a signage system. Never cool colors, but always the real warm color palettes. I've only rarely done things bilingual, where you have a column of English and a column of Spanish. I've had a few occasions to design something, a book, but I enjoyed it. In fact, I put together a whole presentation I can send you a PDF if you'd like of my trip to Cuba in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
The title slides are in English, and then I have it in Spanish on both sides for to share with people. But yeah, I mean, as I said before, even right now, I still feel like from the outside looking in, I still feel my Cuban heritage, even though I can't embarrassingly again speak proficiently, but I'm still very proud of it. I still love putting that accent on my A. Still like telling people, yes, I was born in New Jersey, but I was made in Cuba.
You're married. You said
Yes.
you've been married for 38 years. Did you have kids?
I have one daughter from my first marriage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you able, or did you do anything to pass on that Cuban pride onto her? In what ways?
Well, my daughter's very proud of being Cuban.
Uh-huh.
In fact, she's gotten to be good friends with that cousin who's here. Ramon is his name. And, but Amber's her name. She's 42, 43. She's very proud to say she's Cuban. She uses an accent on her A in her name. She went to Ohio State. She got a degree in art here.
Also an artist, huh?
Yeah. And great photographer. She's a really good. Yeah, she's always will call me sometimes. She's also a bartender at times, which is a tough time to be a bartender right now. But she would tell me, "Oh, Dad, there's this here. You got to talk to this guy. He's a Spanish volleyball soccer player who's here with a group. They're visiting and all that." And she would always love these, Latin root connections that you can make. And she took Spanish, although we're about at the same level. But no, she knows she's going to get all of this stuff. I'm doing a book all about my parents, how they came to this country, not to publish, just something to share with the family. All these photographs I have are all going to go to her, and then she can give it to her other cousins on my brother's side, my brother's children. And I told her, she's promised she's got to go back to Cuba.
She's never been.
She's never been. She has never been. Because she needs to, and I think she'll try to recapture the experiences I went, finding my mother's home in Cuba. The most moving event occurred, Elena was there, and she knows it well. It's photographed. I had always seen the church they got married indoors. I always looked through the black and white glossies. Everything faded to black. You couldn't tell. Never knew what the church looked like. That whole week I was there. There was this one guy, Carlos, who was a taxi cab driver, real taken by my story. And we kept finding the church. And we found it. But it was always closed at a certain time. Till finally the last day I was in Cuba, he said, "Let's try one more time." And boy, we got in there. It was open, went in the back. They still had all the old records of they got married. Because, in Latin weddings, usually you sign the certificate as part of the ceremony. And so I gave him the date they got married. It was in July 9th, 1949. He goes up this rickety old ladder, pulls down this big old binder, flips around, looks. He turns it around, Elena, and there was my mom's signature and Dad. And I lost it, But it was funny. But as I was kind of crying, he tells his assistant, "Oh, I hate when they do this all the time." But yeah, I mean, those things just...
Were you able to take pictures?
Oh, yeah. In fact, that presentation at PDF, I'll make it, you can look at it. Yeah, real kind. You can tell he's probably done this before, but he had his hands with a digital camera. I was taking all the pictures. He revealed little things like, I don't know why it was significant, but he says, "Oh my God, look at the coincidence. Your mom and dad were baptized in the same church," because there were a lot of churches in Havana. So I guess that was pretty unusual for that to happen. But, and then recreated a lot of photos. I had one of my dad by this old Spanish fortress on the ocean in where Ernest Hemingway was from, where he lived, which is about 20 miles outside of Havana. And he took my dad this little picture. He was in a school uniform, and he's sitting by the post, and there's the ocean, and then there's this old Spanish castle. And I found it. And Kohima. That was the name of the village. And I went with these American friends and the taxi cab driver, and I recreated the picture. It was his posting, and my dad had already passed away at that time, but it just felt good to, I don't know, reconnect with him in some way.
Right. Is there any picture of you on that first day of class here in the U.S. with your little suit and your...
I think it's over there. Can I walk over there real quick?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a first day of school picture, huh?
In America.
Oh, my goodness.
My mom didn't know how informal Americans were.
Right. That is beautiful. That is beautiful.
This is in Hoboken, New Jersey. And if you're in the film history, this is where On the Waterfront was filmed. And if you remember, it's a rough area, longshoremen and all dock workers. I went to that Catholic school, and these kids were pretty tough. And here I show up like this, dressed up that first day.
Was that the only day you went like that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, because I told Mom, no, I'm not going to get beat up again.
Right.
No. So next time, just like all the others, a T-shirt and some worn jeans.
Right. Oscar, we are in the middle of a pandemic. It's been now over 6 months now, right? Tell me about how it has affected your life, personally or professionally. Have there been any changes that you had to make, and how have you experienced this times?
A lot of a feeling of isolation, and it's created more urgency for me in a way. I mean, I'm still pretty healthy, heaven forbid nothing, I catch anything. I'm 69. But urgency that I want to get a lot of these projects done, like that family tree, and get things ready for when I'm no longer here. Even I just recently presented to our professional organization here called the Columbus Society of Communicating Arts, and I touched on some of these things. There were 3 posters I created. 2 of them were not paid at all. They were just my attempt to connect and try to create some solidarity with a lot of the terrible social injustice events that occurred. Of course, the George Floyd event. I created a poster just taking his words, I can't breathe. I can send you a PDF of this, but it's gotten a lot of feedback on social media. I mean, even though it's a big poster, the posters live not only on streets anymore, they live on the web now. But I had to do something. I mean, I couldn't believe when I witnessed that event. And so I had to do something. And artists paint, poets write. I'm a graphic designer. I'm going to create a poster. I'm very good working with just typography. And the words, I tried to semantically convey even the intonation of the words. The word breathe gets smaller and smaller as the whole word completes. And I did it all on a black field and a white ground. Another poster was the, it's kind of remarkable to say it now, but back then when it was 100,000 deaths in the U.S., I couldn't believe it. The numbers were getting so large and abstract, they were becoming meaningless. So Elena, I went through this whole process creating this poster. I created these little pictogram figures. I wanted to actually feel what it's like. What is 100,000 people?
Right.
And I created these pictograms. I wanted to make them look human-like. It's digital, but manually I assorted each one because I wanted to somehow touch each one, that these were human beings. These were all members of families. And I didn't do all 100,000, but I did after 250. It was a lot. Then I could start cloning them when I had all these units. And when I had the whole pattern finished, and I had 100,000 assembled, it's done on Adobe Illustrator. I mean, my computer almost conked out because of the large memory. Pulling back, it looked like a quilt. And it almost, kind of a sad accident, but it almost looked like a coronavirus shape. And I titled it Quilt of Tears. And so every figure, represented one, and then this would represent 100. And so it was my way again to just protest. I mean, I was never a protest kind of guy, even though in the 60s I used to have a beard, hair down to my shoulders, and I had a big beard. But I just felt I had to express myself. And that's why I said some solidarity with those people, all others that feel that way. And as a graphic designer, that's how I did them. So I'll send you those two. And then the last one was this poster, which is showing all the type font specimens of this special font to help children read. Because here I'm dealing with all this very pessimistic, these very horrific events and deep concerns and in isolation. And then I'm working on this, it's concluded after 2 years, this project for a next generation, the future. It gave me some hope, at least, because all my life I've been a cursed optimist. I always seen the bright spot. But this isolation, it really has made you reflect, not only the last few years, but your whole life. I think because I'm on certainly the latter end of my life right now, what are you going to leave? What is your legacy going to be? I hope my legacy is one of an empathy, one. What you give back to others? What did you leave for them? And that's something else as a designer that I've adopted the accepted law. Designers are most part anonymous. Somebody designed all these, but you never know their names. And so that type font I've created, there could be 10 years from now, some child learning how to read. They won't know who was behind that and all that, but it doesn't matter. It's what I gave back. And but it really helped me during this time to reconcile with this crazy world we're in right now. Those two very tragic events, and now, and then to do something with some hope at the end, this type font. But that 100,000, I also did a poster for the 200,000. It's really been, I can't believe toward the latter part of my life, I'm in this part of, it is historic. Momentous events going on right around us.
And you've experienced two now, because you said your grandfather was a victim of
it was the Hong Kong flu pandemic back then. So
is there anybody in your family that has personally been impacted?
My cousin in New Jersey, his father-in-law passed away from it. And I keep in touch with him periodically. They live in New Jersey. And, we just keep an eye, I'm certainly very paranoid, being safe, but I think that's okay right now with the situations that we're in. But it's more out of concern for other people. It's just how I am.
What feedback have you received from this posters that you're talking about?
Oh, everything from, boy, you captured it. That's poetry on the posters, especially the I Can't Breathe poster with George Floyd. When you see it, I have the first end quote starting real big and then the letter I in Sancerre, just huge, because I wanted to preserve his dignity and that he was a human being, and saying I, and then going counter movement horizontal is the word can't, which part of his statement, but it also to me represented a kind of oppression in a way. You had the strong vertical, and then all of a sudden the stop, this horizontal, can't. And then the word breathe, each letter, the B begins very fat, heavy, and then as it goes, it gets thinner and thinner, and then it almost disappears. And then I have George Floyd in red. It's the only real small type of George Floyd, and then the day of his death marked there. And so, yeah, I mean, here I am isolated in this little corner in Dublin, me and the cat and my dear wife, and here I am trying to reach out to the outside world and trying to, hey guys, we've got to get this correct. This can't go on. And then still keeping my roots intact, or trying to lengthen them as far as I can, learning from my first cousin. Mimi is her nickname, and telling me stories about family I didn't know about, and hoping to maintain connections elsewhere.
So you've been in Ohio for over 30 years.
Yeah, came here in 1981.
Right. So Oscar, you've been in Ohio for over 30 years, and I want your perspective about how you've seen the state change, the changes you've seen maybe as a Latino man, or even in your profession. Are there more Latino artists out there than when you came here in the 80s?
Yes, to answer your question. When I first came, whether I didn't pursue enough or investigate, but there just didn't seem to be much Latin representation, not only in the community, but also in my profession, especially in design. I didn't know if it was because of the area I'm in, the region, or just other circumstances, but but over time, I noticed especially in the late 80s and 90s, I started seeing a change. Whether I was teaching full-time or practicing, I always taught in some capacity, even part-time. That's how I, at CCAD, that's how I got to know Jeremy Rosario. And Jeremy, I remember he always told me, you don't know how thrilled I was to see somebody who's named Fernandez for the class, because I didn't know English that well and all that. And I would have other situations like that, instances with students, but I started seeing more run-in with other Latinos. I was teaching at Ohio State Design at the time, Elena, and I remember we had several, I don't know why at the time, a lot of Venezuelans coming to go to undergraduate in design. And I remember it forced me, especially giving them a critique about design, trying to tell them that, because usually I would say, okay, you got to make this line much heavier and this one thinner. And I'd have to explain them, and tiene que ser más gordo, and I'm going, wow, I never used that word before to talk about design. And, but it forced me to come up with those words. And even though I could tell it gave them a lot of comfort, even though they knew my Spanish wasn't that great, but just that I tried and I could understand them, that was huge. But I did notice more interest in design coming out of Latin America. Our libraries started filling up. I told them to look, of course, I had told them to look at Cuban graphic design. Come on, you got to add that stuff. And then, even though I wasn't very active in the community side, but I remember There just seemed to be more interest, more social events were taking place, recognizing Latino heritage. In fact, I remember I was in this historical thing happened at Ohio State. The Fisher College of Business organized this trip to Cuba. It was in 2002 or 2002. It was organized by the School of Business, and a group of us, some business people here, it was a group of about 25. We even went all the way to Miami. We were even on the tarmac, ready to fly to Havana, Cuba, and all of a sudden the federal officials there stopped us because I guess the travel agent they mixed up with did some illegal thing, swapping our ID cards for student IDs from Chicago, school in Chicago. Anyway, but I remember it was in the Columbus Dispatch, and there was a big to-do, and I was interviewed because I was one of the victims. But I know I became also often a kind of emissary when I was at Ohio State Design. We had a very active program where we invited outside designers from different parts of the world, from Europe, some from Spain, some would come from Mexico, Brazil. And even though, again, my language wasn't the greatest, but there was always reassurance that I was Spanish because I had a Spanish name, Fernandez. But I didn't over the last years now. That's just every graduate program, there's always a Latin student. In the graduate program, undergraduate, I have like 3 or 4 at Ohio State classes. And then I'm also teaching a UC class, and there's 2 there. One is Cuban. And but what other things have I noticed? I just see a lot more opportunities for restaurants. Besides just Mexican food, even though I love Mexican food, but there's Peruvian, there's Cuban, there's Spanish, and I can't think of anything beyond that.
Right. Oscar, what does Ohio mean to you?
It's my home. It's my adopted home. I joke people when I wear my baseball cap with the letter O. It not only stands for Ohio State, it's Ohio, and it's Oscar. In fact, you would laugh at this because you're an Ohio State faculty. When I was teaching at UC, I'd kid people that I would wear during Michigan Week, I'd wear my Ohio State sweater with a big O, and they say, "You can't wear that here." I said, "Oh, it's O for Oscar." But Ohio, it's home. I feel comfortable here. I think it's always matched my personality. It's funny, I didn't come across Ohio till in high school. I was searching for possible schools, and I remember, maybe Ohio State, that's interesting. And it was only because the movie Goodbye Columbus was out. It was a Neil Simon thing, and it was about Ohio State at the time, and that rung, and little did I know I'd spend all my life, a good portion of my life here. But yeah, it matches my personality. I've always felt comfortable here. In any of the major cities in Ohio, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus, it still feels like a small town. Of course, the population has dramatically grown since I first came in '81. But I like the location of Ohio in relation to the whole country. I mean, I know this statistic. It's always you're within 500-mile radius of all the major urban centers. But I just like the sound Ohio. I even collect songs about Ohio. Aaron Copland, he wrote some pieces about Ohio, and which I like hearing it. And as a typographer, it's nice because you have the two O's on the front and the end. And, but no, in a nutshell, it's just home.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't see myself living anywhere else, except a beautiful place called, and if you've never been, you must go, Brissago, Switzerland.
I have not.
Brissago, and it's just a mile from the Italian border, but it's in Switzerland, and it's on this beautiful lake, Lago Maggiore, and it's heaven.
Oscar, is there anything else you would like to add to this conversation, about your life or your story?
No, just express my appreciation. Thank you for inviting me. I shared some stories that include, it's about my mother and dad, and in a way, it's keeping their memories still alive, even after I'm no longer here. But no, thank you for the experience.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.